The 13th tribe, the Khazar Empire and its heritage. The close cooperation between Khazars and Magyars came to an end when the latter, in 896, said farewell to the Eurasian steppes, crossed the Carpathian mountain range, and conquered the territory which was to become their lasting habitat. The circumstances of this migration are again controversial, but one can at least grasp its broad outlines. During the closing decades of the 9th century, yet another uncouth player joined the nomad game of musical chairs, the Pechenegis. What little we know about this Turkish tribe is summed up in Constantine's description of them as an insatiably greedy lot of barbarians who, for good money, can be bought to fight other barbarians and the Rus. They live between the Volga and the Ural rivers under Khazar suzerainty. According to Ibn Rushd, the Khazars raided them every year to collect the tribute due to them. Towards the end of the 9th century, a catastrophe of a nature by no means unusual befell the Pechenegis. They were evicted from their country by their eastern neighbors. These neighbors were none other than the Gus, or Oghuz, whom Ibn Fadlan so much disliked. One of the inexhaustible number of Turkish tribes which from time to time cut loose from their Central Asiatic moorings and drifted west. The displaced Pechenegis tried to settle in Khazaria, but the Khazars beat them off. The Pechenegis continued their westward trek, crossed the Don, and invaded the territory of the Magyars. The Magyars, in turn, were forced to fall back further west into the regions between the Dnieper and the Surith rivers. They called this region Etel Koz, the land between the rivers. They seem to have settled there in 889, but in 896 the Pechenegis struck again, allied to the Dunabi Bulgars, whereupon the Magyars withdrew into present-day Hungary. This, in rough outline, is the story of the Magyars' exit from the eastern steppes and the end of the Magyar-Khazar connection. The details are contested. Some historians maintain with a certain passion that the Magyars suffered only one defeat, not two, at the hands of the Pechenegis, and that Etel Koz was just another name for Lebedia, but we can leave these quibbles to the specialists. More intriguing is the apparent contradiction between the image of the Magyars as mighty warriors and their inglorious retreat from successive habitats. Thus we learned from the Chronicle of Hikmar of Remus that in 862 they raided the East Frankish Empire, the first of the savage incursions which were to terrorize Europe during the next century. We also hear of a fearful encounter which Saint Cyril, the apostle of the Slavs, had with a Magyar horde in 860 on his way to Khazaria. He was saying his prayers when they rushed at him, Luporium mor ulalantes. howling in the manner of wolves. His sanctity, however, protected him from harm. Another chronicle mentions that the Magyars and the Khazars came into conflict with the Franks in 881. And Constantine tells us that some 10 years later, the Magyars made war upon Simeon, ruler of the Danube Bulgars, and trounced him soundly and came as far as Preslav and shut him up in the fortress called Mundraga and returned home. How is one to reconcile all these valiant deeds with the series of retreats from the Don into Hungary, which took place in the same period? It seems that the answer is indicated in the passage in Constantine's immediately following the one just quoted. But after Simeon, the Bulgar again made peace with the emperor of the Greeks and got security. He sent to the Patzinaks and made an agreement with them to make war on and annihilate the Magyars. And when the Magyars went away on a campaign, the Patzinaks with Simeon came against the Magyars and completely annihilated their families and chased away miserably the Magyars left to guard their land. But the Magyars returning and finding their country thus desolate and ruined, moved into the country occupied by them today, Hungary. Thus, the bulk of the army was away on a campaign when their land and families were attacked. And to judge by the chronicles mentioned above, they were away, raiding distant countries quite frequently, leaving their homes with little protection. They could afford to indulge in this risky habit as long as they had only their Khazar overlords and the peaceful Slavic tribes as their immediate neighbors. But with the advent of the land-hungry Pichengians, the situation changed. The disaster described by Constantine may have been only the last of a series of similar incidents, but it may have decided them to seek a new and safer home beyond the mountains, in a country which they already knew from at least 2 previous forays. There is another consideration which speaks in favor of this hypothesis. The Magyars seem to have acquired the raiding habit only in the second half of the 9th century, about the time when they received that critical blood transfusion from the Khazars. It may have provided a mixed blessing. The Khazars, whom were more efficient in war and more manly, became, as we saw, the leading tribe and infused their hosts with the spirit of adventure, which was soon to turn them into the scourge of Europe, as the Huns had earlier been. They also taught the Magyars those very peculiar and characteristic tactics employed since time immemorial by every Turkish nation: Huns, Avars, Turks, Pichengians, Cumans, and by no other. Light cavalry using the old devices of simulated flight, of shooting while fleeing, suddenly charges with fearful, wolf-like howling. These methods provided murderously effective during the 9th and 10th centuries when Hungarian raiders invaded Germany, the Balkans, Italy, and even France. But they did not cut much ice against the Pechenges, who used the same tactics and could howl just as spine-chillingly. Thus, indirectly, by the devious logic of history, the Khazars were instrumental in the establishment of the Hungarian state, whereas the Khazars themselves vanished into the mist. Macartney, pursuing a similar line of thought, went even further in emphasizing the decisive role played by the Kabar transfusion. The bulk of the Magyar nation, the true Finno-Ugarians, comparatively, although not very, pacific and sedentary agriculturalists, made their homes in the undulating country west of the Danube. The plain of the Alföld was occupied by the nomadic race of Tabars, true Turks, herdsmen, horsemen, and fighters, the driving force and the army of the nation. This was the race which in Constantine's day still occupied pride of place as the first of the hordes of the Magyars. It was, I believe, chiefly this race of Kabars which raided the Slavs and Russians from the steppe, led the campaign against the Bulgars in 895, in large part and for more than half a century afterwards, was the terror of half Europe. And yet, the Hungarians managed to preserve their ethnic identity. The brunt of 60 years of relentless and remorseless warfare fell on the Kabars, whose ranks must have been thinned by it to an extraordinary extent. Meanwhile, the true Magyars, living in comparative peace, increased their numbers. They also succeeded after the bilingual period in preserving their original Finno-Ugri language in the midst of their German and Slav neighbors. In contrast to the Danube Bulgars, who lost their original Turkish language and now speak a Slavonic dialect. However, the Kabar influence continued to make itself felt in Hungary, and even after they became separated by the Carpathian Mountains, the Khazar-Magyar connection was not completely severed. According to Vasilaiev, in the 10th century, the Hungarian Duke Taxoni invited an unknown number of Khazars to settle in his domain. It is not unlikely that these immigrants contained a fair proportion of Khazarian Jews. We may also assume that both the Kabars and the later immigrants brought with them some of their famed craftsmen who taught the Hungarians their arts. In the process of taking possession of their new and permanent home, the Magyars had to evict its former occupants, Moravians and Danube Bulgars, who moved into the regions where they still live. Their other Slavonic neighbors too, the Serbs and Croats, were also more or less in situ. Thus, as a result of the chain reaction which started in the distant Urals, Guts chasing Pechengens, chasing Magyars, chasing Bulgars, and Moravians, the map of modern Central Europe was beginning to take shape. The shifting kaleidoscope was settling into a more or less stable jigsaw. We can now resume the story of the Rus' ascent to power where we left it. The bloodless annexation of Kiev by Rurik's men around 862. This is also the approximate date when the Magyars were pushed westward by the Pechengens, thus depriving the Khazars of protection on their western flank. It may explain why the Rus could gain control of Kiev so easily. But the weakening of Khazar military power exposed the Byzantines, too, to attack by the Rus. Close to the date when the Rus settled in Kiev, their ships, sailing down the Dnieper, crossed the Black Sea and attacked Constantinople. Bury has described the event with much gusto. In the month of June 860, the Emperor Michael III, with all his forces, was marching against the Saracens. He had probably gone far when he received the amazing tidings, which recalled him with all speed to Constantinople. A Russian host had sailed across the Euxine Black Sea in 200 boats, entered the Bosphorus, plundered the monasteries and suburbs on its banks, and overrun the island of the Princess. The inhabitants of the city were utterly demoralized by the sudden horror of the danger and their impotence. The troops, Tagmata, which were usually stationed in the neighborhood of the city, were far away with the emperor, and the fleet was absent. Having wrought wreck and ruin in the suburbs, the barbarians prepared to attack the city. At this crisis, the learned patriarch, Photius, rose to the occasion. He undertook the task of restoring the moral courage of his fellow citizens. He expressed the general feeling when he dwelt on the incongruity that the imperial city, queen of almost all the world, should be mocked by a band of Slavs. Sick, a mean and barbarous crowd. But the populace was perhaps more impressed and consoled when he resorted to the ecclesiastical magic which had been used efficaciously at previous sieges. The precious garment of the Virgin Mother was borne in procession round the walls of the city, and it was believed that it was dipped in the waters of the sea for the purpose of raising a storm of wind. No storm arose, but soon afterwards the Russians began to retreat. And perhaps there were not many among the joyful citizens who did not impute their relief to the direct intervention of the Queen of Heaven. We may add, for the sake of piquancy, that the learned patriarch, Photius, whose eloquence saved the imperial city, was none other than Khazar Face, who had sent Saint Cyril on his proselytizing mission. As for the Rus retreat, it was caused by the hurried return of the Greek army and fleet, but Khazar Face had saved morale among the populace. during the agonizing period of waiting. Toynbee, too, has interesting comments to make on this episode. In 860, he writes, the Russians perhaps came nearer to capturing Constantinople than so far they have ever come since then. And he also shares the view expressed by several Russian historians that the attack by the Eastern Northmen Dnieper flotilla across the Black Sea was coordinated with the simultaneous attack of a Western Viking fleet approaching Constantinople across the Mediterranean and the Dardanelles. Vasilev and Pasikevich and Vernadsky are inclined to believe that the two naval expeditions that thus converged on the Sea of Marmara are not only simultaneous, but were concerted, and they may even make a guess at the identity of the mastermind that, in their view, worked out this strategic plan on the grand scale. They suggest that Rurik of Novgorod was the same person as Rorik of Jutland. This makes one appreciate the stature of the adversary with whom the Khazars had to contend. Nor was Byzantine diplomacy slow in appreciating it, and to play the double game which the situation seemed to demand, alternating between war when it could not be avoided and appeasement in the pious hope that the Russians would eventually be converted to Christianity and brought into the flock of the Eastern Patriarchate. As for the Khazars, they were an important asset for the time being and would be sold out on the first ascent or indecent opportunity that afforded itself. For the next 200 years, Byzantine-Russian relations alternated between armed conflict and treaties of friendship. Wars were waged in 860, siege of Constantinople, 907, 941, 944, 969 through 71, and treaties concluded in 838 through 839. 861, 911, 945, 957, and 971. About the contents of these more or less secret arrangements, we know little. But even what we know shows the bewildering complexity of the game. A few years after the siege of Constantinople, the Patriarch Photius, still the same, reports that the Rus sent ambassadors to Constantinople and, according to the Byzantine formula for pressurized proselytizing, besought the emperor for Christian baptism. As Bury comments, we cannot say which or how many of the Russian settlements were represented by this embassy, but the object must have been to offer amends for the recent raid, perhaps to procure the deliverance of prisoners. It is certain that some of the Russians agreed to adopt Christianity. But the seed did not fall on very fertile ground. For upwards of 100 years we hear no more of the Christianity of the Russians. The treaty, however, which was concluded between 860 and 866, led probably to other consequences. Among these consequences was the recruiting of Scandinavian sailors into the Byzantine fleet. By 902, there were 700 of them. Another development was the famous Varangian Guard, an elite corps of Rus and other Nordic mercenaries, including even Englishmen. In the treaties of 945 and 971, the Russian rulers of the Principality of Kiev undertook to supply the Byzantine emperor with troops on request. In Constantine's Porphyrogenius' day, example, the middle of the 10th century, Rus fleets on the Bosphorus were a customary sight. They no longer came to lay siege on Constantinople, but to sell their wares. Trade was meticulously well regulated, except when armed clashes intervened. According to the Russian Chronicle, it was agreed in the treaties of 907-911 that the Rus visitors should enter Constantinople through one city gate only, and not more than 50 at a time, escorted by officials that they were to receive during their stay in the city as much grain as they required, and also up to 6 months' supply of other provisions, in monthly deliverances, including bread, wine, meat, fish, fruit, and bathing facilities, if required, to make sure that all transactions should be nice and proper. Black market dealings in currency were punished by amputation of one hand, nor were proselytizing efforts neglected as the ultimate means to achieve peaceful coexistence with the increasingly powerful Russians. But it was hard going, according to the Russian Chronicle, when Olg, regent of Kiev, concluded the Treaty of 911 with the Byzantines. The emperors, Leo and Alexander, joint rulers, after agreeing upon the tribute and mutually binding themselves by oath, kissed the cross and invited Olg and his men to swear an oath likewise. According to the religion of the Rus, the latter swore by their weapons and by their god Piran, as well as by Volos, the god of cattle, and thus confirmed the treaty. Nearly half a century and several battles and treaties later, victory for the Holy Church seemed in sight. In 957, Princess Olga of Kiev, widow of Prince Igor, was baptized on the occasion of her state visit to Constantinople, unless she had already been baptized once before her departure, which again is controversial. The various banquets and festivities in Olga's honor are described in detail in De Ceremoniis, though we are not told how the lady reacted to the Disneyland of mechanical toys displayed in the imperial throne room, for instance, to the stuffed lions which emitted a fearful mechanical roar. Another distinguished guest, Bishop Liutprand, recorded that he was able to keep his sang-froid only because he was forewarned of the surprises in store for visitors. The occasion must have been a major headache for the master of ceremonies, which was Constantine himself, because not only was Olga a female sovereign, but her retinue too, was female. The male diplomats and advisors, 82 of them, marched self-effacingly in the rear of the Russian delegation. Just before the banquet, there was a small incident symbolic of the delicate nature of Russian-Byzantine relations. When the ladies of the Byzantine court entered, they fell on their faces before the imperial family, as protocol required. Olga remained standing, but it was noticed with satisfaction that she slightly, if perceptibly, inclined her head. She was put in her place by being seated, as the Muslim state guest had been at a separate table. The Russian Chronicle has a different, richly embroidered version of the state visit. When the delicate subject of baptism was brought up, Olga told Constantine that if he desired to baptize her, he should perform this function himself. Otherwise, she was unwilling to accept baptism. The emperor concurred and asked the patriarch to instruct her in the faith. The patriarch instructed her in prayer and fasting, in almsgiving, and in the maintenance of chastity. She bowed her head, and like a sponge absorbing water, she eagerly drank in his teachings. After her baptism, the emperor summoned Olga and made known to her that he wished her to become his wife. But she replied, "How can you marry me after yourself baptizing me and calling me your daughter? For among Christians that is unlawful, as you yourself must know." Then the emperor said, "Olga, you have outwitted me." When she got back to Kiev, Constantine sent a message to her saying, "Inasmuch as I bestowed many gifts upon you, you promised me that on your return to Rus, you would send me many presents of slaves, wax, and furs, and dispatch soldiery to aid me." Olga made answer to the envoys that if the emperor would spend as long a time with her in the Pochena as she had remained on the Bosphorus, she would grant his request. With these words, she dismissed the envoys. This Olga Helga must have been a formidable Scandinavian Amazon. She was, as already mentioned, the widow of Prince Igor, supposedly the son of Rurik, whom the Russian Chronicle describes as a greedy, foolish, and sadistic ruler. In 941, he had attacked the Byzantines with a large fleet, and of the people they captured, some they butchered, others they set up as targets and shot at. Some they seized upon, and after binding their hands behind their backs, they drove iron nails through their heads. Many sacred churches they gave to the flames. In the end, they were defeated by the Byzantine fleet, spouting Greek fire through tubes mounted in the prows of their ships. Upon seeing the flames, the Russians cast themselves into the seawater, but the survivors returned home, where they related that the Greeks had in their possession the lightning from heaven, and had set them on fire by pouring it forth, so that the Russes could not conquer them. This episode was followed by another treaty of friendship 4 years later. As a predominantly maritime nation, the Rus were even more impressed by the Greek fire than others who had attacked Byzantium, and the lightning from heaven was a strong argument in favor of the Greek church. Yet they were still not ready for conversion. When Igor was killed in 945 by the Derivians, a Slavic people upon which he had imposed an exorbitant tribute, the widowed Olga became regent of Kiev. She started her rule by taking fourfold revenge on the Derivians. First, a Derivian peace mission was burned alive. Then a delegation of notables was locked in a bathhouse and burned alive. This was followed by another massacre. And lastly, the main town of the Derivians was burnt down. Olga's bloodlust seemed truly insatiable until her baptism. From that day onward, the Chronicle informs us, she became the precursor of Christian Russia, even as daybreak precedes the sun, and as the dawn precedes the day. For she shone like the moon by night, and she was radiant among the infidels like a pearl in the mire. In due course, she was canonized as the first Russian saint of the Orthodox Church. Yet in spite of the great to-do about Olga's baptism and her state visit to Constantine, this was not the last word in the stormy dialogue between the Greek Church and the Russians. For Olga's son, Svyatoslav, reverted to paganism, refused to listen to his mother's entreaties, collected a numerous and valiant army, and, stepping light like a leopard, undertook many campaigns, among them a war against the Khazars, and another against the Byzantines. It was only in 988, in the reign of his son, Saint Vladimir, that the ruling dynasty of the Russians definitely adopted the faith of the Greek Orthodox Church, about the same time as Hungarians, Poles, and Scandinavians, including the distant Icelanders, became converted to the Latin Church of Rome. The broad outlines of the lasting religious divisions of the world were beginning to take shape, and in this process, the Jewish Khazars were becoming an anachronism. The growing rapprochement between Constantinople and Kiev, in spite of its ups and downs, made the importance of Itil gradually dwindle, and the presence of the Khazars athwart Rus-Byzantine trade routes, levying their 10% tax on the increasing flow of goods, became an irritant both to the Byzantine treasury and the Russian warrior merchants. Symptomatic of the changing Byzantine attitude to their former allies was the surrender of Cherson to the Russians. For several centuries, Byzantines and Khazars had been bickering and occasionally skirmishing for possession of that important Crimean port. But when Vladimir occupied Cherson in 987, the Byzantines did not even protest. For, as Bury put it, the sacrifice was not too dear a price for perpetual peace and friendship with the Russian state, then becoming a great power. The sacrifice of Cherson may have been justified, but the sacrifice of the Khazar alliance turned out to be, in the long run, a short-sighted policy.